start with a riddle. What's the one activity that consumes 85% or more of our time at work, and yet 75% of people say it's dysfunctional? Email? Meetings? Email and meetings are examples of
communication, multitasking.
I heard it, collaboration. As knowledge workers, we spend most of our time collaborating, whether in meetings, email, juggling a slew of different technologies. We invest so heavily in these technologies. But how many companies actually take a moment to think, is this collaboration effective? Think back to your day yesterday. How many times did you collaborate with a colleague? Maybe in Slack, Zoom, maybe a hallway conversation, maybe an intense brainstorm session. We obsess over every single dollar in our budgets. And yet when it comes to collaboration, the activity we spend most, 85% or more of our time on, too many workers and too many leaders, they close their eyes, they cross their fingers, and they hope for the best. We would never tolerate this type of reckless inefficiency in any other part of our organization. So why do we accept it when it comes to collaboration? It's because collaboration is so invisible. It happens through so many different people, places, processes, technologies. It's very hard to optimize something we can't fully see or measure. You probably know that some part of collaboration is broken in your organization, but you probably can't quite spot the problem. And so that's the challenge. That's the challenge we're up against. Take a look at some of this data. This is data from our latest State of Work Innovation report that we're launching on Tuesday. We surveyed more than 13,000 knowledge workers across the world, 6 different countries, and we saw just how harmful this lack of collaboration and this lack of visibility into collaboration actually is. Just 19% of employees in remote and hybrid organizations say that people work effectively across teams. Now, this is roughly on par with what we see in in-person environments too. And only 20% think their communication tools are effective for cross-functional work. The reality is, in too many organizations, and perhaps in yours as well, collaboration is broken. At the Work Innovation Lab, we study the science of how people work, and more important, how people can work better, faster, and smarter. To do this, we partner with our amazing customers at Asana, as well as leading academic and industry experts from all across the world. What you're looking at here is how collaboration happens in an actual Asana customer. The nodes, those are individual employees. The links between them are collaborations, assigning tasks to one another, developing workflows, working toward shared goals. They're color-coded by different functional groups: marketing, operations, IT, sales, product. This is powerful, right? Because it shows how collaboration is actually happening in an organization, not just how we think it's happening. Our team has spent years studying the science of effective collaboration, and what separates the most effective companies from the least? What are their secrets? Looking across tens of thousands of different companies and using AI and other models, we've determined there are 5 key dimensions of collaboration. These are the dimensions that separate the most effective, the most successful companies from the least, no matter which way we slice it. Revenue growth, Fortune 500 status, innovation, company culture, employee engagement. And the good news, all of these dimensions are ones that you can improve and understand and optimize in your organization. So let's go ahead, let's break them down one by one. The first dimension of collaboration is what we call collaboration equity. How equal is collaboration across an organization? What we know is collaboration is not equally distributed across our organizations. On the one hand, you have your workhorses. These are the people who take on extra tasks. They often work late to finish them. They're often at a greater risk of burning out. And they're also often your highest performers. They're the ones people count on to get work done. You might even be one of them. They're often founders, leaders. They're often remote workers. And then alongside these high performers, you have people who aren't pulling their weight. 52% of employees say their teams rely on just a few high performers to get work done. This is actually more promising in remote and hybrid work environments than it is in in-office environments. It's more equal, but still so much room for improvement. Half of employees say their teams rely on just a few high performers to get work done. That puts those higher performers at greater risk of burning out. But it's more than just burnout. It also breeds resentment, frustration. No one likes feeling overwhelmed while others coast by. And if you have people whose skills and talents are underused, your team's never going to reach its full potential. You're leaving results on the table. Let's break this down with a real example. Earlier this year, we had a major hybrid media company come to us with a problem. Their employees were burning out and they were quitting. Understandably, they needed to solve the problem and they needed to solve it quickly. So what did we do? We built this organization a dashboard that showed how workload was distributed across different teams. With that dashboard, they were then able to take action. They were then able to understand how workload compared, and they were able to more proactively prevent burnout. Since then, we've seen collaboration become much more equal within the organization. This visibility into how collaboration happens and whether it's equal or not can be really powerful. Last year, we published research in Harvard Business Review that showed just how powerful this visibility can be. As part of the experiment, we built a dashboard for a group of employees that showed them how their own collaboration compared to people within their same functional group and role level. 93% of people changed how they were working just as a result of this new information. People who were over collaborating, they realized they probably needed to scale back, spend more time on individual focus work. And people who were under collaborating, they realized they weren't contributing enough to their teams. They stepped up. Nearly everyone changed how they were working as a result of this new information. The reality is, especially as a leader, you can't ask your employees whether they're overloaded. In some cases, they might not know themselves. In other cases, they might be afraid to tell you, especially those high performers, especially those remote workers. And inevitably, in some cases, people are going to exaggerate their workload. In our research, we found that about half of employees say their colleagues sometimes exaggerate their work just to avoid taking on new projects. Visualizing collaboration and visualizing collaboration equity is how we solve this problem. Because if we can't see the problem, we certainly can't solve the problem. So that's the first dimension of collaboration. The second dimension of collaboration is cross-functional collaboration. Over the past few years, we've seen the amount of time we spend collaborating with other functions increase and increase. Right now, we see 84% of workers in remote and hybrid work environments spend at least some of their time collaborating with other teams. That's higher than what we see in in-office environments, fully in-office environments. And in many ways, that's what we would expect. We know that cross-functional collaboration is essential for our most important work. Take a moment and think about the most important, mission-critical workflow in your organization. Every important workflow in our organization involves multiple different functions. It needs to be that way to bring in different expertise, different ideas, different skills from across our organization. But while cross-functional collaboration is essential, it's also expensive. And in particular, for every new person we add to a collaboration, we incur what we call a collaboration tax. And just as we're taxed a bigger tax rate, the bigger our paycheck, we're taxed a bigger rate the more people we add to a collaboration. Let's do just a little bit of math here. If we have 5 people involved in a collaboration, there are 10 different ways they can and will collaborate. Add one more person, 6 people, that number increases by 50%. 15 different ways they can and will collaborate. And once we get up to 12 people, there are 66 different ways they can and will collaborate. Now in practice, what does that mean? It means more meetings, more emails, more status updates, more time, more effort, more tasks. And so the answer isn't more cross-functional collaboration. The answer is smarter cross-functional collaboration, because we know that that tax is also higher when collaboration happens cross-functionally, because we're also having to navigate different perspectives, different personalities, different priorities. We found that collaboration and cross-functional collaboration specifically follows this bell-shaped curve. Too little collaboration, our teams will underperform. We're not bringing together those different expertise, skill sets, ideas. But too much collaboration can also be detrimental because we're overworking and overloading employees. We're piling on that collaboration tax. We found that there's a sweet spot, especially for innovation. The most innovative companies, they have about 30 to 50% of all their collaboration that happens cross-functionally. So how do we get to this sweet spot? How do the best, most innovative companies get to this sweet spot? First, they invest in technologies that actually support cross-functional work, technologies that both their engineering teams and their marketing teams know how to use and enjoy using. Second, and this one is especially important in remote environments, they create visibility and transparency into work so that anyone, regardless of function, can understand the status of work, who's doing what, by when, and why, because that enables them and others to move work forward at a much lower tax rate. And third, these companies strategically determine who they need to collaborate with more versus less. Now that's not easy, and that's why data, research, and insight become so incredibly important. In our research, we found that the number one predictor of innovation within a company is the strength of collaboration between marketing and engineering. Number one predictor of any functional pairing. Now, that's not necessarily intuitive, and it's certainly not something that most leaders and workers proactively think about. But great leaders, they do. Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, remote first company, he says he measures the health of companies, including Airbnb, by the strength of this collaboration between marketing and engineering. And think about Apple. Every new product that Apple launches, it's a great collaboration between marketing and engineering. When Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, he didn't position it as a new technology. He didn't position it as a new gadget. He positioned it as a lifestyle change, a new way of working, a new way of living, a new way of interacting with the world. That was great marketing of a great technology. Let's break this down just a little bit further with a real example. Last year, we had a major transportation company come to us with a problem. In the words of their CIO, they had data, but they didn't have intelligence. And what she meant by that is she knew collaboration was broken in the organization, but she couldn't quite spot the problem. So what did we do? We diagnosed the problem, and what we saw is a lot of it was rooted in the HR function in this organization. HR was 54% less likely to collaborate cross-functionally compared to HR teams in other similar organizations. You can see the problem. We know HR is a critical cross-functional partner for so much of an organization. They weren't collaborating cross-functionally. With this information, they were then able to reintegrate HR within the organization, and since then, we've seen significant increases in cross-functional collaboration. So, Do you know how well your marketing and engineering teams are collaborating? How about your HR teams and other functional groups? All of these relationships matter, and they matter a lot to the health of our companies. Let's move on to the third dimension. This is one that we're all passionate about, collaboration across physical space. As we all know, collaboration isn't just about who we collaborate with, it's also about where we collaborate from. One of my favorite studies comes out of MIT decades ago. They found that when people are seated in an office 6 feet away from one another, they're 4 times more likely to collaborate compared with when they're seated 60 feet away from one another. And as that distance increases, collaboration decreases if we're not intentional about it. This is what we saw when we mapped out how collaboration happens in a hybrid organization. In this organization, employees were required to be in the office 3 days a week. They could work remotely the other 2 days. You can see the difference in collaboration. On the left, much less collaboration, much less cross-functional collaboration. And on the right, much more collaboration. Now, one side isn't necessarily better or worse than the other. On the left, you have much more focus work, individual focus work. But unless we're intentional about it, and unless we're able to visualize how collaboration changes as we move across physical spaces, collaboration is going to suffer. When we visualize, we're able to proactively spot the silos and prevent them from becoming bottlenecks before it's too late. Most people we know work in a hybrid capacity or have the option to do so. Whether you're working remotely full-time, whether you're in the office or somewhere in between, we need to be intentional about how we're collaborating across these physical spaces. Because if we're not, we're leaving collaboration to chance. And we know chance, it's not a strategy, it's a gamble, and we can't afford to gamble with our team's success. The fourth dimension of collaboration is collaboration across work. We know that collaboration is not created equal across different units of work. And at Asana, we think about work in terms of a hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy, we have tasks, individual units of work. Those tasks then ladder up to projects. And ideally, but not always, those projects then ladder up to support our company goals and ultimately our company mission. Now, in our research, we see that that connection between tasks and goals, it's a massive driver of employee engagement. Everyone needs to see how their work contributes to the bigger picture. In the Asana platform, for every 10 pieces of work that workers connect to goals, engagement increases by 7%, and the more they connect, the bigger the payoff. For every 100 pieces of work they connect to company goals, engagement increases by 101%. But unfortunately, in too many organizations, that connection between work and goals, it just isn't there. Just 55% of workers in remote and hybrid organizations say they're clear on how their own work helps their company reach its goals. That's roughly on par with what we see in in-office environments too. Half of people don't know how their work contributes to the bigger picture. It's really demotivating. Right now, we see a lot of companies measure superficial metrics to assess employee performance. Bugs fixed, lines of code written, sales calls made, blogs published, campaigns launched. The reality is, if these pieces of work are not connected to company goals, they probably don't matter all that much. And being assessed and judged by them, if you can't see the bigger picture, can be really demotivating. It's a big reason why 38% of workers say they don't feel fully responsible for delivering high quality work. 2 in 5 workers don't feel fully responsible for delivering high quality work. The way we fix this is by showing them the connection between work and goals. If they don't see the connection, we start to see that they tune out. They start to disengage. And what they also do is they start to replace meaningful work with busy work. 65% of workers, no matter which type of organization we look at, in general, about 2/3 of workers admit to performing what we call, and others call too, productivity theater. They say it's sometimes more important to show they're busy than to actually do meaningful work. They schedule meetings, they send emails, they pack their calendars, not out of necessity, but because it makes them look busy and it makes them look important. They're busy, but they're not productive. How do we solve this? It starts by connecting those tasks to company goals. That's how we're able to distinguish between meaningful work and busy work. That's how we motivate employees, because at the end of the day, it's not about doing more work, it's about doing the right work. 2 years ago, the session could have stopped here, but we have a new dimension of collaboration that's impacting all of our organizations, and that is collaboration with AI. We see massive growth in the adoption of AI within every type of organization. Earlier this year, we did some joint research with Anthropic, where we found that already more than half of knowledge workers are using AI each week. It's a massive growth of about 44% just in the past 9 months. But what we also know is it's not enough to just use AI. We need to truly collaborate with it to get the benefits. And what we see is the more we collaborate with AI, the more we get those benefits. When workers use AI just every month, only 39% report productivity gains. When workers use AI each week, 73% report productivity gains. But when workers use AI each day, when they truly collaborate with AI, 89% report productivity gains. It's not enough to just dabble with AI. We need to truly collaborate with it to get the benefits. Now, we know there are lots of different applications for AI. There are lots of different use cases for AI, but we also know that not all use cases are created equal. And depending on what we use AI for, it impacts how productive we are with the technology, as well as whether we're likely to continue to use the technology. In our research, we found that the number one predictor of whether people increase their adoption of Asana AI is whether they use AI to collaborate cross-functionally. Number one predictor. Now, why is that the case? It's the case because AI is at its most powerful when it has complete context into how your organization works. If you restrict AI to just one function, you're going to limit its potential. You might optimize what's best for your HR team or your IT team, but you're not going to optimize what's best for your entire organization. And that's what really matters. AI is at its most powerful when it's able to look across those really complex cross-functional workflows. And it's able to spot the bottlenecks, spot the silos, and it's able to spot those parts of workflows that are broken, parts of workflows that we can't always see as humans. The second biggest predictor of whether people increase their adoption of Asana AI is whether they ask AI follow-up questions. Now, why is this the case? It's the case because when we ask AI follow-up questions, we're not just treating it as a tool, we're treating it more like a teammate. And what we see is it's in those moments of back and forth collaboration that AI shows its real power. It shows its ability to learn over time. And it shows its ability to respond to us, interact with us, work in a type of teammate capacity. And that's where it starts to earn its spot in our workflow as more of a trusted teammate. Now, there's some really fascinating psychology at play here as well. Right now, we see that most workers, they see AI as a tool. If you ask people, what would you compare AI to? Most people, 53%, say it's a tool. But there's a small group, a group of just 9% of employees, they see AI differently. They see AI not as a tool, but as a teammate. And what's really fascinating is this small group of 9% of employees, they're significantly more likely to report productivity gains with AI. Now, why is this the case? It's the case because when we treat AI as a teammate, we're less likely to think about the technology narrowly as a point solution for very specific tasks. And we're more likely to think more holistically about the technology. We're less likely to ask, what can AI do for me? And we're more likely to ask, what can I do with AI as part of more complex workflows? And that makes us more productive. So I want to end with where we began, with a riddle. This one comes from one of our research partners, Rob Cross. 5% of people in general are responsible for what percent of all the valuable collaboration that happens within an organization? Any guesses? 5% of people are responsible for what percent of all the valuable collaboration that happens within an organization? 68. So I think I've convinced you of collaboration inequity in organizations. It's not quite that high, but it's still too high, 35%, which is shocking, right? 5% of employees responsible for about 1/3, up to 35% of all the valuable collaboration that happens within an organization. So as you leave today, think about all of these dimensions of collaboration, how you're going to understand, how you're going to optimize them, how are you going to better understand how you and your workers, your colleagues, spend that massive 85% of our time, and why 75% of people say it's dysfunctional? Because collaboration is not a riddle to be solved, right? It's the backbone of our team's success. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Julie. I work in the defense industry within a finance capacity. And so in my organization, we have, I don't know exactly how many, but at least a dozen collaboration tools that our employees are using. Not every employee is using every tool, but it's very complex. So what advice would you give our organization? We probably can't get rid of any tools, at least not at this time, but how can we work or collaborate more effectively when we have so many systems?
It's a great question, and it's one that we see executives face every day. What's really interesting is we are seeing this massive push in general for consolidation of collaboration tools. And what's interesting from a research perspective is we actually see that's what workers want now as well. About 65% of them say they would rather their whole organization standardize on a set of tools rather than every team using their own specific tool suite. That's hard from an organizational change perspective. We actually did a study last year with Amazon. We called it the Collaboration Cleanse. We essentially asked every employee who participated to stop using half of their collaboration tools. There was this sense of, on the one hand, we published this research, and we framed the article in terms of there was good news and there was also bad news. The good news is nearly everyone, by the end of just that 2-week period, they could eliminate one or more tools from their tech stack. So they were able to cleanse their tech stack. But the bad news is they recognized that they alone could not fully optimize their tech stack. And they recognize how important that role of leadership is in helping them decide what is that core tool set. So it needs to be top down. We find you can tinker at the edges, but technology is so dependent. It's dependent on us. It's dependent on our customers, our collaborators, that we need that top-down buy-in. If you can't consolidate, if you can't eliminate, integrations can be really powerful. We see that when people, and actually as part of that experiment, one of the biggest changes people made is they started to lean into integrations. So integration, Slack, Zoom, all the different possible ways you can reduce that context switching cost. we know that when we become distracted as we switch from app to app to app, it can take 23 minutes or more to return back to the original task. Shocking. So integrations are a way that you can sort of hack some of that from that experiment point of view, still get the benefit of multiple technologies, but not be logging in, logging out, and context switching.
Question about, was really fascinating, that one graph where you were showing remote collaboration versus hybrid collaboration. But then in hybrid collaboration, you're having a lot more, but then you also kind of talked about the strain of collaboration, like too much is actually bad. So what have you seen work as far as reducing kind of that strain? Because like that is what all these return to offices are all about, is about this collaboration. But what I found super interesting is like, well, people are stressed out when you're doing all of this unintentional collaboration. So what do you suggest?
Great question. I think one of the biggest unlocks we see when we work with companies is this distinguishing between coordination and collaboration. There tends to be this halo effect associated with collaboration. We've actually done some research where if you ask people, what do you think about when you think about collaboration? They're much more likely to think about teamwork and really positive sentiment type things versus coordination. It tends to be a more neutral or even negative connotation. So because of that, we think collaboration is good. We think more collaboration is good. But what we know is the best organizations, and especially some of those remote first organizations that are leading the way, they focus much more on coordination. So coordination is essentially sequential work rather than back and forth reciprocal type of interaction. So how you enable that is you create foundations and tools that enable asynchronous work, right? What we also see is a lot of companies have tried to go asynchronous, but they've failed because they haven't had the right foundational models in place. So they haven't had that single central source of truth. People are putting documents in all sorts of different places. If you don't have that single source of truth, people start to tap each other on the shoulders. Synchronous tools start to pop up, more meetings, more status updates in real time. And then you also need to create a documentation culture, a writing culture. We see remote first companies, what they do really well is they prioritize a writing culture. It's even baked into their onboarding process. They really help organizations, their people within their organization understand, how do I communicate in a way where it doesn't require a real-time response from another person? But it's not something we can just say, we're going to have a no meeting day or we're going to go asynchronous. We really need to develop those foundations for it to work and it to stick, or else people are going to revert back. And sometimes we even see an overcorrection. In many companies, we've seen an overcorrection of now more synchronous work than before the pandemic because they've tried and they haven't had the foundations and they realize it's not working.
I have a question about equity. So I manage a team of 32, and we know that those stats are real, that some people are working a lot more than others. Collaboration is more strong in some areas than others, but we're not really sure how to measure that. So we've considered, obviously people over-report their work sometimes. We've considered asking them to log their time, but we're worried about resistance for that. So I'm wondering how you recommend figuring that out.
It's a hard problem, and what we see is it's so important to start to measure work outcomes. So many organizations measure work output, so essentially the quantity of work, how many tasks you complete, how many bugs you fixed, and what that leads to is a perverse incentive system where people start to game the system. How can they get more clicks? How can they get more tasks completed? The more you can connect work to company goals and outcomes, the more you start to incentivize the right behavior. And I think what we see is, a work management tool can be really powerful because it shows that connection between work and goals, right? It's really clear who's contributing to those company goals. It's really clear who's completing the work on time versus not. If there's not that accountability in the system, then workers are going to find ways around it. Next week we're publishing this big report on Tuesday where we look at all these what we call toxic behaviors in organizations. And a lot of those behaviors are not because of the individual, they're fundamentally because of the system. And the system hasn't been set up in a way where it's clear who's doing what by when and who's contributing to the most important workflows in the organization. And then I have seen some organizations, we did research with a fantastic organization last year, ICF, a large 13,000 employee organization, and they've actually built an assessment of collaboration into performance reviews such that employees are evaluated not just on their own individual performance, but how they work in a group. Are they, do they have good meeting hygiene? Do they complete work on time? Do they engage in these behaviors that we know are conducive to great teamwork? So I think, and I hope we get to that point where we start to focus more on outcomes, we start to focus more on team behaviors versus the individual. And we're seeing that with AI right now. There's a really big focus on using AI to optimize individuals. And we know sometimes it's called the tragedy of the commons, where if we focus too much on the individual, we lose sight of the bigger picture, and team and organizational effectiveness can actually be harmed if we're focusing too much on boosting individual productivity and performance.
Thank you for that. It was a great presentation. I had a question about number 5, collaboration with AI. I work for a small tech company that hasn't put out any policy guidelines on AI use, and I was just curious if you had it. So there's sort of this sort of assumption that, for example, some of the code that you may be writing, you're not necessarily using AI for example, right? So just wondering if you had any advice on how do you broach the topic when senior leadership has not done that yet?
Has not really embraced the technology.
Yeah, they haven't talked about it really at all.
There's so many different angles that you can approach it at. I think one of the biggest, and my PhD, a lot of the work focused on change management associated with AI and how important those mental models are that we approach technology. What we've seen is throughout the history of technology, for every major technological advancement, there's been fear and there's been resistance. When the telephone was first introduced, people thought it was capable of transmitting evil spirits. They thought that the contents of their conversations would spill on the floor if the telephone line was cut. So we've seen all this resistance, and it's a natural human response. What I've seen really effective in organizations is flipping the switch from a mental model perspective. And we've done some fascinating research on what we call AI mindsets. And there's so many different components of it, but I've even seen companies outright ban the term artificial intelligence and replace it with augmented intelligence or amplified intelligence. The more we can start to position the technology as more of that teammate versus as a threat or as a tool, we tend to see greater adoption of the technology. It seems trivial, but the psychology is really powerful. Another thing we see is you need to acknowledge the skepticism. We did an experiment a few months ago where we put employees in different groups and looked at how can we encourage a more positive outlook associated with the technology. And for those people who were skeptical of AI, it didn't work to just present an overly optimistic view of the technology. What worked most is acknowledging that skepticism. It's natural, acknowledging the risks, acknowledging the fact that AI is going to have negative implications if we aren't thoughtful and responsible about it, but then also presenting the positive side and telling a more balanced story. So I think there's lots of things we can do from a technical perspective and pilots and small scale experiments that also help. But I think what's overlooked in many organizations is that psychology and how powerful the storytelling and narrative around the technology is.
Thank you so much. You're so gifted, and I'm so glad you're here. So I'd love to hear a bit about your thoughts on project managers and, the challenge of like how much is embedding everything you just talked about within like a team culture versus hiring some folks to like do that on our behalf as an organization. And, is there a right way to go about it? Do you need the embedded aspect of the team culture regardless of project manager? Just curious from like a people perspective as if you were planning an organization and wanted to do this really well, what's the role of a project manager within collaboration?
So it depends completely on the organization and the complexity and the level of conflict at play. One of the things I'm really excited about in terms of the Asana platform is we do sort of democratize that project manager role such that everyone can start managing and coordinating and collaborating. And I think everyone needs to be a project manager regardless of what role, what level of the organization you're at. We will always need dedicated project managers as well, especially for those really complex workflows. Organizational change is so hard, as we all know, that it needs to require a mindset shift to make any meaningful change. It needs to be top down, it needs to be bottom up. If employees aren't buying into it, then no amount of consultancy or outside expertise can start to solve these problems. And I love, there's this idea of the IKEA effect, where if you have employees build something or contribute to something themselves, they're much more bought into the process. So where we see organizational change go wrong in so many cases is when you have that exclusively top-down mandate, whether it's an external consultant or internal, everyone needs to play a part. And when it comes to project management, everyone needs to have a say in how the process is unfolding, and they need to understand their own role in the system. So it's very organization, workflow to workflow specific, but everyone needs to and has a responsibility to play a role.
Thank you.